so much for joining us for our first spring lecture series. My name is Caitlin Sager, and I'm one of the program coordinators at the Mansfield Center. This is our first lecture of our series. We have many more great lectures coming up on topics such as women's leadership and U.S.-Japan relations. I encourage you to take one of our schedules, please. We hope to see you at future lectures. This lecture is also being recorded by the Missoula Community Access Television as one of their media access grants, and it will be available for streaming on MCAT. And we want to thank MCAT for continuing to be our partner on these lectures. We also have an exciting opportunity coming up for young university students who are interested in political leadership called the Montana New Leadership Program, designed to help engage women students in political activity and leadership training. It's a wonderful opportunity, and applications are open now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker of this series, Dr. Eric Schlessel. Dr. Schlessel is the head of the East Asian Studies program at UM and also a professor in the history and political science departments. His focus of study is on Xinjiang, in the Muslim region of China, as hopefully you either know or will learn more about today. Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, well, thank you, Caitlin, as always. As always, Caitlin Sager is great, and the Mansfield Center is a wonderful asset to this campus. Actually, the classes I'm teaching this semester, so East Asian Civ and Politics in China, are both kind of the two that Mike Mansfield taught here back in 1934. So I'd like to think that I'm carrying on that tradition, and that's thanks in large part to the Mansfield Center's dedication to Asian studies and maintaining Ambassador Mansfield's legacy over the course of these many years. So thank you very much for having me, as always. As Caitlin pointed out, oh dear, well, I'll just work around that. As Caitlin pointed out, so I spent about the last 18 years of my life dedicated to the study of China in various forms, and the past 13 of them focused specifically and especially on the northwestern corner of China. It's northwestern 1/6 of land area, the space called Xinjiang, which I'll introduce briefly. So what I'm going to do is, are we good? There we go. Okay, I'll give you a quick background on the region. I'll do 300 years of history in 5 seconds. And then we'll move on to recent developments since 2016, 2017. I'll talk about the story of a friend to give you some human understanding of the impacts of what's been happening recently, and close up with some discussion of why certain policies have been advanced in Xinjiang over the past couple of years. So there's been a major change recently. And we'll try to explain why that is and what's going on. So for those of you who aren't in the know and haven't heard me rant about this yet, Xinjiang, also known as Eastern Turkestan, well, the name in Chinese means new frontier or new borderland. And it was effectively added to the territory of the Qing, the last dynasty of imperial China, in the 1750s. Since then, and like I said, 200 years in 5 seconds, there have been sporadic periods of relative independence, relative integration into the Chinese polity. But when you get to 1949, the People's Republic of China effectively inherited this entire land mass. Now, there were good reasons for it. Xinjiang has enormous natural gas deposits, some coal, lots of copper. It's considered a large open area, possibly good for a population outlet. But as you can see, it's also, as of 1949, was surrounded by the Soviet Union and the Soviet satellite state of Mongolia. So Mao Zedong and his group thought that Xinjiang would be an excellent bulwark against potential Soviet expansion. They definitely want to keep that territory right in their sphere of influence and direct control. So you see it's right north of Tibet, southwest of Mongolia, east of Central Asia, south of Russia. Now that led to a little bit of an issue, because whereas the majority of the Chinese population, about 91%, are what we'd call Han Chinese, people who speak the Chinese language natively, people who are what we think is culturally Chinese. I'm saying, I'm doing the big strokes here. There's a lot of variation within the Han Chinese population, but officially that's 91% of all of China. As of 1949, that's about 5% of the population of Xinjiang. That's changed today. At the time, 75% of Xinjiang's population was a different group of people entirely, called Uyghur, or in Uyghur, Uyghur. Now it's 45%. We can broadly define the Uyghur people as practicing Sunni Muslims with a generally pretty secular bent, who speak a language completely different from Chinese, but related to Turkish, almost mutually intelligible with Uzbek, closer to Kazakh. So it's very different from China proper, culturally, religiously, ethnically, linguistically. This is a basic problem because the majority of the leadership of China was Han Chinese, and in many ways the communist movement was also a Chinese nationalist movement that was inflected with the desire to let the Chinese people ethnically, nationally stand up for themselves. So what do you do with a vast region inhabited mostly by people who are emphatically not Chinese, and as of 1949 wanted to reestablish their own republic on the model of sort of a more secular-leaning, culturally Islamic state of the Republic of Turkey, as it was at the time? How do you reconcile that? Well, the solution was to establish a so-called autonomous region for the Uyghur people. This is a compromise between the Uyghur right to national self-determination, as enshrined in Chinese thought as well as international thought, and between the demand for territorial sovereignty and national sovereignty on the part of the People's Republic of China. There's 5 autonomous regions in China. This is one of the biggest. Okay, so that's an issue though, because the autonomous region was meant to be, and constitutionally is, an independent zone for the development of Uyghur language, culture, and life, to let people develop economically and culturally independently of China proper, well, without actually being independent. In practice, the autonomous regions has always been controlled more closely by the center than most interior provinces. It's especially the case after 1978. So, here's a region where we are. Northwestern China, Muslim majority. In Xinjiang through about the 1980s and 1990s, events largely tracked what happened in China proper. You had the massive disruptions of the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. In many ways, Xinjiang was protected from the worst of it, because Xinjiang was also important militarily, and the center wanted to protect it. But any attacks on traditional culture in Xinjiang were not directed specifically against Islam or against Uyghurs. They were directed against essentially everything old. It was part of the national destruction of everything old. Into the 1980s and 1990s, Uyghurs maintained a high level of linguistic independence, cultural independence, and actually that era is remembered as a golden age by a lot of Uyghurs, because that's when lots of literature was revived, there was independent scholarship and publishing in Uyghur. It was independent to a degree largely because the state was focused on developing the East industrially first, right? Building up the quality, standard of living for the majority of people in Eastern China, the Han Chinese. And was content to leave this area in the West well enough alone to remain a potential bulwark against Soviet expansion and to be a source for natural resources. Well, that began to change around 2000. This has always kind of been part of the plan when the economic development strategy moved from China's east over here into what they call the West. So not the 90% of the population here, but this large, sparsely populated area, including Tibet, Xinjiang, Qinghai, Western Inner Mongolia, all the bits that hadn't been economically developed before. Well, this drive for economic development, which was also aimed at further integration infrastructurally with all of Eurasia, started to change events in Xinjiang, the pivot of the entire plan. So we have oil pipelines going from Xinjiang down to the coast for shipping. Now the idea is that Xinjiang will be one big stop for China on a series of highways crossing all of Eurasia. This is one belt, one road plan to integrate China better into the world economy. Well, and in 2000, industrialization started to hit Xinjiang. Increasing population movements sponsored by the government in migration from China proper began to arrive in Xinjiang. The population balance started to shift. And simultaneously, the government realized that it was time to make the cultural change as well. So this is, if you want to look it up, Nicolas Bequelin has a great article called Staged Development in Xinjiang, where he talks about how this is part of a series of 5-year plans to better integrate the West into the Chinese whole, not just economically, but also culturally. That led to some early changes. In 2001, there's a beginning of the elimination of the Uyghur language from the public school system, first at universities, and then beginning in 2004, a long-term plan to eliminate Uyghur language teaching from all schools down to the preschool level, everywhere in Xinjiang, even in places where there were no Han Chinese, to teach the language. This had all sorts of complications, as you can imagine, and it was not a very popular policy because this took school choice away from Uyghurs, who would often send one child, because you can have two if you're Uyghur, one child to the Chinese school, one child to the Uyghur school. And now everyone had to go to Chinese school. So this is an ongoing issue. These sort of assimilatory policies did not produce widespread active discontent or protest for a long time. There was sporadic protest, there were complaints publicly. Things really came to a head in 2009 when a group of Uyghur workers in a toy factory in eastern China got into a conflict with some Han Chinese factory workers in the same factory. In the night, there had been an accusation of sexual assault that turned out to be false by one of the Uyghurs against a Han Chinese worker. Han Chinese workers beat two of these Uyghur workers to death. One person helped incite the riot. He was eventually put to death. And by and large, this incident gave Uyghurs it crystallized for them the sense that the government was not protecting them equally as workers and as citizens. You know, they'd seen changes to the economy in northwestern China. It seemed like all the new jobs coming from development were going to Han Chinese and not to Uyghurs. Workers on new infrastructure projects were not local Uyghurs. They were Han Chinese shipped in from China proper. So there's a sense that Uyghurs weren't getting their slice of the pie, that they were still excluded from the development project. And even when they were sent to China proper, they were not being protected. On July 5th, 2009, in the Xinjiang regional capital of Urumqi, there began a peaceful protest by a group of students carrying the Chinese flag who asked for cultural protections, the revival of linguistic protections, and proper protection for workers in China proper. Now, this snowballed pretty quickly due to massive discontent into a huge riot in which about 195 people were killed, several hundred more were injured. So July 5th, 2009 turned into a race riot. That was contained pretty quickly because troops were moved in from central China, from Gansu province nearby, overnight. But 2 days later, there was another backlash from the Han Chinese majority in Urumqi city. That prompted 9 months of martial law, and things have never been the same in Urumqi. Let's see. This also coincided with, in 2001, of course, September 11th happened. And China quickly took advantage of the international climate of anti-terrorism to claim that a fictional terrorist group was engaging in terrorist organization in northwestern China. There wasn't any evidence for the group's existence. It seems like more recently one branch of the Turkestan Islamic Party has taken on this name for itself. But this meant that from 2001 onward, lots of small protest events, including local protests against police actions, were construed in the media and prosecuted as terrorism or attempts to split the homeland instead of protest. So again, there's a sense for Uyghurs that, okay, China has over 200,000 protests a year. And usually the government in China proper listens to that, they take that on board, they respond in some degree to citizen complaints against unpopular policies. But in Xinjiang, it's all called terrorism. That seems unfair to a lot of Uyghurs too. So July 5th was at first an attempt to protest against this, the characterization of all Muslims as terrorists. This photo here is a woman 2 days later confronting a group of military officers in an APC, demanding to know where her disappeared son has gone. Lots of men were disappeared in the wake of the riots and haven't been seen since. So the reaction to this, and I've talked about that at this forum here before, was initially, well, first of all, it was realized that the leadership in Xinjiang had done a bad job of controlling discontent. So the party secretary was expelled and a new one was brought in from Hunan, who was supposed to be a lot more telegenic, a lot better at public diplomacy, a lot better at selling the party's message. Well, instead, the crackdown continued in ways that seemed bizarre to most people. The main reaction against this kind of violence were things like this, Project Beauty. This was a 5-year project that told Uyghur women to take off their clothes and show their beauty to the world, direct quote. Again, not very popular with not necessarily very conservative, but certainly modest Muslim women, being told to stop dressing, and almost no one in Xinjiang dresses like that, but to wear instead the colorful clothing that you'll recognize from the propaganda poster back here, to look ethnic and not religious, to look Uyghur and not Muslim. Similarly, in the anti-extremism campaign, as it was called, men were commanded to shave off their beards. Certain parts of Xinjiang implemented rules where men were fined or jailed for growing beards or comporting themselves in certain ways. And at the same time, there was a crackdown on what we in the US would consider very everyday, very anodyne religious practice. So in one place, Aksu, which I'll get back to in a minute, morning prayer meetings were regularly broken up by the police. Imagine having a prayer breakfast stormed by the local constabulary. This bothered people tremendously because they felt that their everyday Islamic practice was being abused. Islamic teaching is already restricted to the age of 18 and above. You're only allowed to practice at a mosque if you're an adult, and prayer is meant to only happen in the mosque. So there is a broader crackdown on what we might think of as everyday religious practice. Overall, this wasn't terribly effective. And I'll show you in a second, but it's actually in this period, when you get to 2014, that we finally see what we can really call clearly terrorist incidents in Xinjiang, where we start to see suicide bombings happen for the first time in the region. And even though there's still no evidence that these are orchestrated by an outside group, although ISIS tried to claim responsibility a couple of times, there is a sense that Uyghurs have begun to take on the active vocabularies and actions of international terrorism. They don't have the supplies to do it. But for example, in this bombing in the capital of Urumqi, I think it was 38 people were killed when two groups of men in SUVs threw bombs out their windows, crashed their cars together in an apparent attempt to explode a major morning market. Now, the problem with analysis in this period is that the Chinese government labels everything terrorism. So here, it's a crappy timeline. I apologize for that. I'll make a better graphic someday. But if you look at everything that the government claims to be terrorism and compile that with, say, incidents involving, that have been reported by other media about Uyghurs being victims of police violence, we actually see relatively little of anything that we could construe as terrorism per se early on. The Tiananmen Square attack seems to have been a matter of an individual having a certain discontent and possibly mental illness. But there's a big uptick after the so-called People's War on Terror was declared in April 2014. Now, this is sort of a textbook case of how you get Islamic extremism. You crack down on Islamic practice, you label Muslims extremists and terrorists, and then what do you get? You usually get extremism and terrorism, because people feel pressure, they feel persecuted, and so there's a backlash. This happened, so there's the Aksu incident. Now, Chinese state media reported a clash between 50 terrorists and the police in which the terrorists were killed in the central city of Aksu. Well, if you look at the broader set of reports surrounding it, the terrorists included 2-year-old children and entire families who appeared to be fleeing the state. These were families who in Aksu had been the victim of a crackdown on everyday religious practice, on those prayer meetings, on mosque attendance. And because these families had been fairly regular attendees at mosque, because they were known to be religious, they've been taken into re-education centers over and over again, some for stretches of up to 8 months or more. So it seems like this group of people is actually trying to flee the state for Kazakhstan, not that that would have worked, and was stopped partway on their journey. This incident seems to have put an end to the Chinese state's aggressive crackdown on Islamic practice, because we're pretty sure that someone in Aksu realized the cause and effect of the policy and the backlash that had led to the armed conflict. So there's an end of an era. But the solutions remained weird. I talked about this last time I had a brown bag, is that the People's War on Terror was mostly a cultural war. Mandatory dancing was implemented across many cities in southern Xinjiang. You were required to enter dance competitions to dance to the Little Apple Dance, which is kind of the Chinese Macarena. And it was widely reported that if people did not participate in these dances, they'd be taken to re-education. So you have to demonstrate your loyalty by doing this ridiculous and heavily Han Chinese inflected thing, or you'll be punished. Obviously, this wasn't working. This kind of plan it seems nonsensical. It's not something that a rational state really does. So there have been some changes lately. And I'm here to talk about them because, well, I've been going back and forth to China for the past 13 years. And of course, I hear things from my friends. And this past summer, I heard people tell me that things were worse in Xinjiang than they've been in 40 years. That all of a sudden, the past year, everything had changed. That things had gone from a state of relative contentment and peace, everyday friction, to something that they hadn't seen since the Cultural Revolution. I wondered, why is that? I had a friend call me up on a secure channel and tell me a story about what had happened to him over the summer. And when that happened, I felt a moral and ethical duty to communicate that. He asked me to tell his story. People have been asking me to tell their stories because I have, for some reason, some kind of authority when I stand here in a suit. And well, that's why I'm here today. That's why I asked the Mansfield Center to give me this platform. I was meant to talk about this in November. Jury duty happened. And actually, since then, all of this I'm about to talk about has started to get into the international media, which is great. So I'm going to keep things fairly short today, but I encourage you to look all of this up in the Financial Times and New York Times, Wall Street Journal, South China Morning Post is a great source. A lot of outlets are talking about this now. So I'm going to give you that. I'm also going to give you analysis as to why all of this is happening in the next 20 minutes or so. It takes a long time to orient you to Xinjiang. It's a place not many people know. So what's happened since 2016 is basically this, is that the state's changed its approach. Instead of bringing in the charismatic party secretary from Hunan, a central province, they brought in Chen Quanguo, who is formerly the former party secretary of Tibet. Now, being the party secretary of Tibet is a great step on the road to power. Here he is with Secretary Xi Jinping, who also used to work in Tibet. Right? This is known as a way to, you didn't? I'm thinking of someone else then. Thank you, I apologize. You know, I thought that Xi Jinping had a post in Tibet.
Never.
Never.
Never worked in Tibet.
Thank you, I apologize. All right. So the point is, though, that Chen Quanguo had successfully implemented in his 5 years in Tibet what he called a grid-style societal management program. This was 5 years in which he had successfully increased the police presence across Tibet that successfully put an end to the widespread discontent that had been seen there in the previous 5 years. So he was a natural choice to bring to Xinjiang and take care of similar issues. Now, he has managed in 1 year in Xinjiang what he did in Tibet in 5 in establishing this program with, I love the Orwellian touch here, things called convenience police stations. So, okay, what does grid-style societal management mean? Oh, and by the way, he now has a place on the Central Committee of the Politburo as of last November. Okay, so here's a chart of police recruitment in Xinjiang for the past 11 years. You can see a strong uptick after Chen Quanguo arrives. Over 90,000 new positions in the police have been advertised. And you see that there's been some increase in surveillance staff, but primarily there's been an increase in assistant police for people who take care of sort of lower level policing functions. The idea has been to increase a police presence across Xinjiang and to create convenience police stations that staff about between 6 and 30 officers to basically extend that monitoring everywhere that's possible. If you'll walk along the streets in Xinjiang, here's a fairly typical scene, is that here's in Kashgar. A couple different kinds of police will be present. There are patrols nearly everywhere. That's been the case for many, many years. Since 2009, you've seen a different kind of presence. You've seen men standing in sort of garrison format, surrounded by riot shields, especially on the streets in Urumqi about every 2 blocks. That is now becoming a permanent fixture with the establishment of these new policing stations and systems, so that there's always a presence there. Now, okay, at these convenience stations, what is getting checked? What are people checking for? Now ID checks are in place all over the region. So under the previous party secretary, the region introduced a kind of internal passport called convenience card, which you had to show whenever you crossed a county boundary or a city boundary. To get this convenience card, you had to go back to your hometown, apply at your local police station, and then carry that with you. This meant that most Uyghurs had to return to their hometowns, but because they had no work history there or had worked semi-legally outside of home, end up being stuck where they'd grown up. After that, it wasn't possible to move from place to place without this internal passport. Now that was abolished in 2016 with the implementation of a whole new set of security measures, including biometric data collection. So if you ever want a new ID card in Xinjiang, you need now to have a retina scan done, DNA sample taken. That's the law, at least. If we look at the local implementation of the policy according to official documents, we see that everyone is being required to re-register and have their samples taken. So it was reported that at least 19.2 million people have had their samples taken in Xinjiang already, officially between the ages of 12 and 65, but they're also asking people over 65 to get them done. So the police are compiling a massive database of people's DNA and their physical features. We're starting to see some of this get implemented in China proper, where police are wearing these Google Glass-like goggles, and on the trains for people heading back home for Chinese New Year, they can immediately scan people's faces and check if they match your ID properly. So this is a whole new integration of information that's unprecedented in China's Northwest. The program's called Physicals for All. So supposedly this is so that everyone in Xinjiang can get properly checked. But it's clear from the policy documents themselves that the intent is also to properly gather all this biometric data using fancy technology usually purchased from US companies. What's happened with the database already? Okay, so in Xinjiang, among Uyghurs, serial marriage is very common. So polygamy has always been very uncommon, but people will have one husband or wife, then another, then another, then another. And this tends to make the children's registry records very, very messy. So people often have way more children than they're supposed to, because somehow they get lost in the system. The DNA records are already being used to verify parentage and make sure that children only have one assigned mother and father. People are being fined retroactively when they're found out to have more children than they're allowed. So there's that, which is rather troubling and problematic, and this also, to my mind, poses a whole new level of invasive penetration to people's everyday lives. So these new cards with your biometric data, you have to show them when you go to any checkpoint. There are many along the streets. Getting on a bus these days, you get your stuff searched. There's a high-speed bus system in Urumqi now. Search when you get on that. If you go into a bookstore, this has been the case for a long time, or any business, you're meant to register with your ID card. Now there are scanners, because smartphone technology makes it easy to scan things, just like payments, and keep track of people. So this kind of scanning and checking has become pervasive across the region. Simultaneously, we've seen an expansion of re-education. Re-education has always been some aspect of the modern Chinese state. Reform through labor is officially gone now. It has been for a few years. And in China proper, we've seen a great reduction in re-education enterprises like these. You know, liberalization in China proper, but a crackdown in the West, in Tibet and Xinjiang. Now, supposedly about 500,000 Uyghurs are now estimated to have been brought into re-education centers over the past year and a half. Given that the Uyghur population is, by Chinese estimates, about 9 million, by foreign estimates, about 11 million, that is a very high proportion of the Uyghur population. There are documents that demonstrate that in some areas, local governments have been commanded to bring upwards of 50% of the Uyghur population into the re-education system. So there's a documented prejudice against Uyghurs specifically in this program. What happens to the children when your parents are sent to re-education? Well, two things are happening. One is that many of these children are ending up in orphanages to be reassigned to other parents, or they're apparently sent to China proper. There's also a new system of boarding schools. And boarding schools have always been a feature of Chinese education. But in Xinjiang, there's been a preference to keep children close to their families, in part because settlement in Xinjiang tends to be very dense and close. Well, now there are separate boarding schools that keep children apart from their parents during the week, and they return home only on weekends. This is a way to ensure that there is a Mandarin immersion environment for the children throughout the week. Which certainly sounds like forceful cultural assimilation to me. Now, the Chinese have arguments that Chinese language is a much more marketable skill. Uyghurs have always recognized that. It's just that they preferred it when it was an option. That's where the discontent comes from. Moreover, there's been a shift in the way the state has approached Islam. So instead of cracking down on all Islamic practice, the state has now specified which kinds of Islam are permissible. So for a long time, they were forbidding dancing at weddings because dancing is Islamic. Then they turned around about a year and a half ago and said, well, now you have to dance at weddings because dancing is joyful and it shows that you're secular. At the same time, and this is published by official state media, there's been burning of prayer rugs, Islamic posters, and various Islamic paraphernalia, as well as the elimination of the official translation of the Quran from bookstore shelves. So there appears to be a purging of Islam from the public sphere, even though in China, all of this material is produced or controlled in some way by the official state Islamic organization. And we'll get to that in a second. So that's where we are now in terms of the new policies. That's been about a year to year and a half that this has been implemented. It seems unprecedentedly invasive and public, and you have to wonder why someone would do it. Well, let me tell you a story that my friend told me. I've changed his name, I've changed the location because I'm on TV, but he wanted me to tell you. This young gentleman, whom I'll call Niaz, because that's a common Uyghur name, you'll never be able to find him, studies outside of China in North America. He went back home this past summer. He's never had trouble before. Young Uyghur man, very cosmopolitan, very secular. He's culturally Muslim. He doesn't eat pork. He keeps halal. But he's not a frequent mosque goer, never has been. Always a good student in school, always been a good citizen of the state. Until this past summer, when Niaz landed at the Shanghai airport and he was going into immigration, preparing to get his connecting flight back home to Xinjiang, when instead he was detained by the police. He didn't know why, there's no explanation as to why, but he figured, okay, it's fine, it's China, there's a lot of security. Well, instead, he was detained without explanation for 2.5 days in a holding cell. And no one would tell him exactly why this was. It turned out that instead of letting him take his flight to Xinjiang, there were police coming all the way from his hometown by train across China to collect him in Shanghai and take him back. Why was that? Okay. Well, they showed up, they said, oh, there's been some trouble. We need to take you in, some holding, some questioning. Now, my friend is very smart. He knows, don't ask questions, don't make a fuss. This will all be fine. They got him a plate of noodles because he hadn't had much to eat for the past couple of days. They got him on the train. But that also meant that for the next 2.5 days on the train back to Xinjiang, his hands were zip-tied. He was not allowed food, and he only had water to sustain him. Now, to be fair, they would have given him food, but everything had pork in it that they offered him, so he wasn't going to eat that. Eventually, my friend was taken back to his hometown, apparently without any notification to his family, who eventually figured out what was going on, and was held in a detention center with upwards of 100 other Uyghur men who had been abroad. So this is now pretty well publicized, that China is asking Uyghurs abroad to come back and asking countries where Uyghurs are, especially in the Middle East, to send Uyghurs back to China for questioning. My friend in this case was surprised because he's studying in North America. Most of the people around him were studying in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, places like this, with government permission, obviously. Some of them had been there for 2 months. One guy had been there for 6 months already and felt that he would never get out. He'd been in Egypt. So my friend spent the next 2 months of his summer on 1 piece of steamed bread a day and boiling water. He lost a lot of weight during this period of time. This is a guy who loves to work out. He's always pumping iron, and he hated this. He was bored, he wasn't allowed books, and he spent the entire time essentially meditating in his cell and talking to the other detainees. He's interrogated several times. The police suspected something was up because he didn't seem like the right kind of person to be detained. So he was never beaten, but several of his other inmates were. Now eventually, he's well connected, a family member made the right call, someone pulled the right string, and my friend was released. On the way out, the police told him, don't worry about it, it was a clerical error. Which is not really what you want to hear. I guess it's kind of comforting. But they also told him, okay, go back, do your studies, but if you do anything that contravenes the law of China, your family will be in trouble. Now, this is a very common strategy in Xinjiang when dealing with Uyghurs who are going abroad. And not only do you have to put down a large deposit just to get abroad, and to get your passport from the police, because now all passports are held centrally at police stations, but your family will be under scrutiny. It's almost impossible for a Uyghur abroad to get their entire family out, because once you do that, the state no longer has leverage over you. So, my friend got out. He said he was a good boy, as he puts it, for a few days. Said nothing, did nothing, stayed home, got in a plane, got back to North America. And then he's out. At the end of 2 months, he got into some therapy. He called me and a few other friends and asked us to communicate what he'd seen and what was happening, because my friend is very, very lucky. A lot of people aren't. So that young man who'd been in Egypt was later reported to have died in detention. His name was Yasin John. He was one of a couple of identified students who'd been in Egypt at Al-Azhar University with the approval of the Chinese state. He passed away. Around the same time, this man, Muhammad Salah Hajim. Now, Muhammad Salah Hajim was a good servant of the state. He was trained by the state as a Muslim cleric within the institutions of the state at the madrasa in Urumqi that the state used to train Muslim clerics. Okay, so he's official. He'd been commanded at one point to produce an official translation of the Quran by the Chinese state, the same translation that's now been pulled from bookshelves. He and his entire family were taken into custody in, I think it was October, I have notes, along with his daughter, along with his wife. And while in detention, he passed away. And it's not just limited to people like this. Okay, so we have two examples of a Muslim student, and we have an Islamic cleric, albeit one who owes loyalty to the state and who always in his preaching would preach loyalty to the Communist Party. We also have, well, I'll mention he's not on here, but there's a good Communist Party official from a southern town. I think it was Korla, if I recall correctly. Now, he was a party member. His wife was a party member before him and ran a factory. His daughter was a police officer who had studied in an all-Chinese university in China, can't even write in Uyghur because she is so fully assimilated into mainstream Chinese culture. Now, their family had even received only one of 4 ethnic unity awards given to Uyghur households in the history of the state. Possibly one of the best servants of the state you could find. They too were targeted because back in, I think it was September, it was found that some of the workers at his wife's factory had been praying together. And so his wife was accused of spreading religion. She lost her position. His daughter lost her job. He lost his party membership. His wife was detained. And so he eventually gave an interview with international media basically saying, I have nothing left to lose. I don't know what's going on. And that's the only reason we can know his story. So he's not safe. Well, this guy, Zhang Haitao, originally an immigrant from Henan, an electronics salesman, who on Weixin, popular Chinese social media platform, had criticized government policy. He lives in Xinjiang. Well, now he's detained in Xinjiang. He's jailed, won a 19-year sentence, because he criticized ethnic policy in Xinjiang. His wife and son have managed to escape to Texas, by the way, so at least there's one kind of happy ending in here so far, but who knows what will happen to Zhang Haitao himself. So everyone's being caught up in this. It's fun because you see Eastern China and things are liberalizing and opening up, but if you get to the West, things are tightening more and more and more. They're tightening more and more effectively as well. We've seen a gradual perfection of the surveillance state under Chen Quanguo. But we have to ask why. Okay, this is a textbook case of how you don't prevent extremism or terrorism. This is a textbook case for how you produce discontent in a region. And it's been obvious since 2000 that these are all basically bad ideas. Now, it could be that the state knows a lot more than we do, and that they see a threat that may be manifest that is not apparent to international media or international observers. Okay, but there's another possible explanation for all of this. Now, this isn't official policy. This is one police official in Kashgar who's saying this. I think it shows the approach that's being taken. It's no longer piecemeal, it's no longer targeting individuals, it's more of a firebombing kind of approach to resistance. A complete and total attempt to control movement in society. Why would you do this? Is it malice? I don't think so. No one's that irrational. Do people hate Uyghurs? No, I don't think that that's the problem. This is the best explanation I have. It comes from Tom Cliff, who is a really excellent scholar of contemporary Xinjiang. And it's basically that what's happening in Xinjiang with securitization and surveillance is the same thing that's happening across the country with other kinds of developments. Local officials are incentivized to buy new equipment and use it to create problems and then apply their new equipment to those problems. It's true of infrastructure. I've personally seen the same road paved 3 times in a year in Xinjiang. Why? Because someone needed to show that they were building infrastructure in Xinjiang, that they were taking this so-called backwards place and building a new bridge, building it up for the country. That's how you get promoted as a party official or a government official, by using government money well to show that you're doing grand things for the country. You don't want to be posted to Xinjiang. Tibet is the same way, by the way. You don't want to be posted to either of these places. If you want to get out of your terrible posting in Western China, you'd better find a way to build it up or crack down on something. So infrastructural development is driven in large part because money from the center, and this has changed a bit under Xi Jinping, who's been better at cracking down on corruption, often goes into the coffers of these officials, or they award contracts to their own connections and friends. That's part of the reason why most workers on infrastructure projects in Xinjiang come from China proper, because they're using hometown connections and paying their friends back home. It's what we call crony capitalism. And it appears that this combination of displaying loyalty to the party and the program and over-enthusiastically implementing, say, the command to crack down on terrorism shows that you will advance. It'll get you more grant money from the center and help you move more of that money into private hands. It's the best explanation I have, because this implementation is uneven. If you look at different counties in Xinjiang, things are done differently. Since Chen Quanguo came to office, it's been more total across the province. But for the most part, Khotan and Aksu, these 2 places, seem to have the most stringent application and sometimes most arbitrary application of these commandments from the central government, whereas other regions are much more lenient. It looks like this is a matter of local actors developing certain habits in response to state incentives to develop and securitize. It's not unlike, when you grant police stations or police organizations in the US to buy military hardware. They'll buy it and they'll find a reason to use it. So that's my spiel on what's been happening lately. This is what I've heard from friends, this is what I've seen from reliable sources. And that's my best explanation as to why any state would implement these kinds of policies. Fundamentally, I want to emphasize this. I don't think that there's some sort of commandment from Beijing to be cruel to its citizens. But I do think that there are structural incentives in place that have led to some very weird interpretations of central policies in China's western regions that in turn cause discontent and cause precisely the problems that people claim to be solving. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your patience and your listening. I look forward to questions, comments, and rabid criticism. Thank you. Yeah, Terry.
This kind of policy obviously sort of flies in the face of the One Belt, One Road initiative, and that we are open to all the peoples in the region. How are the Chinese massaging this? Are they just suppressing information out of the region?
Oh, I think you know the answer to this. Well, okay, so Xinjiang is not completely not open. There are parts of Xinjiang where if you're Pakistani, you can go without a visa because that trade is really critical to cross-border relations. China is encouraging trade. Urumqi is China's 5th biggest port. This isn't contrary to One Belt, One Road. I think it's part of it. So the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is China's, I'll just put it very simply, way of forming alliances and partnerships across Central Asia, into South Asia, into Russia. And part of that is security, and part of that is economic. Part of the assurance that China gives to its neighbors is that Xinjiang will be a stable place to do trade. So I think that if they show that they're actively cracking down on the kinds of instability that you might see in Uzbekistan or Pakistan, then that might actually reassure regional partners that this is a place to do business. Yes, please.
My wife and I spent 2 weeks in the Silk Road in Western China in 2012, and from a tourist standpoint only, it seemed safe enough for us. I wonder how tourism has changed in relation to this. Are they trying to protect that like trade, or is that up or down?
They're really trying to develop tourism in Xinjiang. And again, protecting the image of safety is very useful for that. That said, since 2012, things have changed a lot. I was there in 2012, and they're very different from the way they are today in terms of the security presence. I'd say that contact with foreigners is much more closely monitored these days, to the point where, I didn't even note this, at the security checkpoints, your phone will be scanned for extremist material and for foreign contacts. So people are eliminating Westerners or foreigners from their phones left and right. That has had a sort of chilling effect, and it also means that primarily Han Chinese are being involved in that kind of contact with outside tourists, less than Uyghurs who used to dominate the industry much more. No, but they're trying very, very hard to develop specific tourist sites where you can visit and keep people away from the sort of less pretty or seemingly unfriendly places. Although I'll emphasize that Xinjiang, compared to a lot of parts of the US, is still very, very, very safe. Yeah, Curtis.
Yeah, I'm just curious, with the way you described it at the end of structural incentives that encourage this kind of racist exploitation, have you considered using any kind of neo-colonial models on this kind of homeostatic imperialism? Because the same thing with neo-colonial theories isn't that there is a driving ideology or plan from the metropole to control them, but you still have a very similar structure and the same kind of exploitation of the periphery.
It's an interesting thought. The thing is that because this applies across China in different ways, I'm not inclined to see Xinjiang as being necessarily that special a regime or as a colony. And I also think that a lot of Western observers throw around the word colony willy-nilly as a way of very cheaply criticizing China. If this is neo-colonial, then it's a kind of neo-colonialism that is applying in different ways across the entire Chinese state, but that has been inflected in special ways in the borderlands because of ethnic and religious difference. No, but I do appreciate that, because that's how the state works. There's a central directive that has to be interpreted in different ways at different levels of the state. That's how the PRC can function and carry out policy. Yes. Okay, what did I get wrong this time? Tell me.
I come from China, and in my research work, something about Xinjiang province, but only for some ideology from East in my research work. And first, thank you so much for Dr. Eric's thought-provoking speech. And he has sent a lot of messages, especially Chinese government policy on Xinjiang province. He said, in the PPT, I think all are facts. From facts.
Facts?
Yeah, from government policy to some tragedies, all are true stories. But some, I think there's one side about the facts, because I have do some survey during my stay in Xinjiang, especially now as the situation has been changed much, especially from last year, and we have our government has a lot of new policies in Xinjiang, especially solve some 解决这个民生问题。
什么样的民族的问题？民生
Human life.
哦，人身问题。
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I think The facts in the PPT has some the things we changed. Maybe chilled, especially 4 or 5 years ago, happiness. Now, the situation in Xinjiang has been changed a lot, especially for the human life. I will share with you a story. And here the facts we said the Chinese government cracked down at some terrorists. Actually, there a lot of tragedies have hanged Chinese killed. One of the tragedies can't be open in the public media is the cost of one reason.
是看是光局长。 Yeah, 公安局长。
Yeah.
Yeah, the head of the Kashgar Public Security Bureau.
Yeah. When he went fishing after work, and he was killed with a cutter.
He was attacked by men with knives, that's right.
Yeah.
Dismembered.
Yeah.
I remember that story.
You know this?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And a lot of such tragedies happened there. Okay. And I will ask you a question. If Chinese government doesn't crack down such terrorist acts, what should Chinese government do?
Well, first of all, and thank you, Dr. So I really appreciate that. For the first part, but this is one thing I'm trying to distinguish here is not everything is terrorism. And not everything needs to be treated the same way. Especially attacks on the police often appear to result from some sort of individual or local conflict. And so we have to be very careful about construing every attack on a government official as somehow the result of a web of planning. There are a lot of individual acts, and I think that we need to distinguish those very carefully because they're conflated in a lot of the Chinese media. Yeah, there are a lot of tragedies, but I think there are tragedies across China that if they weren't happening in Xinjiang, we wouldn't call them terrorism. Now, as for what the government should do, I think Uyghurs were very happy in 1999. Everyone remembers the 90s as a wonderful time. They remember benefiting from economic developments. They remember being able to send their children to whatever school that they wanted to. They remember having a sense of freedom and self-control and agency. Now, they've never really had political representation because this is China, that's how it works. The autonomous region doesn't represent the Uyghurs, it represents the region. But my sense is that people would like to return to that state of affairs. That people were quite, they all say this, even in private, even when they're quite drunk. You know, they'll say, I was happy as long as I could keep my family fed. And I didn't feel like I was being excluded. I think that if there were, and there are preferential policies in place to benefit Uyghurs on university exams and things like this, but I think if the PRC cracked down on discrimination in hiring practices and in contracting to ensure that development projects fed into Uyghurs' own share of the economy, that would help tremendously. I think bringing back true bilingual education would help tremendously. I think adding a degree of real cultural autonomy would help tremendously. And basically backing off of everyday mosque practice or visitation to shrines. Islam wasn't a problem until really recently, and I think that it's largely the government that made it a problem. So that is my sense of what could be done, is that things were really pretty good about 17, 18 years ago. And returning to that state of affairs would be generally beneficial.
Thank you.
Welcome. Yes, sir.
Well, I had the same impression, roughly, in the course of your narrative, and it sounded like the government started to do a kind of a Hutung style I think you termed it I can't remember, surveillance state.
Sure.
Which mirrors something from 30 years earlier, which is very common. The question to my mind was, if the pressure on the Uyghur people and against the Uyghur culture, roughly, began before there was real resistance to the Han government, why did they do that? Why did they start leaning on those people before there was really resistance to what they were doing? At the time when, by your description, the Uyghur people were relatively happy with what they obtained. Now, one possibility is you got it wrong, and another possibility is they had something else in mind, like pushing through with this notion of a new Silk Road, and that somehow led them to. Do you have any?
So the question is, where did the discontent come from before 2000 or 2001?
Why did the central government start pushing?
Oh. And that's intimately related to the Open Up the West program. It was seen as the time when they could start pushing. Effectively, China's already done this in many ways with the Han in the East by working to eliminate local differences in language and culture and such during the development process. So in many ways, what they're doing in Xinjiang mirrors what they've already done in Guangdong or Guangxi or Fujian. It's mirroring what they've been doing in Tibet for a little while, sure, and there's a direct transfer of technology here. So I think that they saw that this is just a natural part of the economic development process, was this kind of integration. There had been discontent before that, of course, famously in 1997, the Gulja incident, which was when basically local Islamic groups decided to hold a soccer tournament, and in response the state overreacted and moved tanks onto the soccer pitch, and that turned into a riot. But things weren't regular in this way until after the economic push began. And I don't think that the full effects of that were being felt until around 2008, 2009.
Do you think the Han government, the central government, just expected that there would be resistance to their push to reach across the great deserts to the west?
I think that they anticipated some. The central government has always anticipated a degree of pushback. I don't think they realized how much there would be from the people who are supposed to be on their side. So there's a large Uyghur urban educated population that they thought was going to go along with this program. And I don't think that they realized that a lot of the resistance would come not just from rural farmers, but from that urban educated elite. I think that's what spooked them. Yeah.
South China Morning Post for the last couple of months has been following China's unclear incursion into Afghanistan. The official government policy is that they are not setting up some sort of effort to deal with the security of Afghanistan, but the evidence on the ground indicates that they do seem to want to become next in line to fix the country, which has its own ramifications. But what I'm wondering is, are you seeing any other indications that the Chinese government is inserting itself into other parts of that region where the Western world sees its biggest threat of, for want of a better term, Islamic terrorism?
Sure. China's done this for a while in Pakistan, especially, in part because there are a lot of Chinese factory workers in Pakistan, and they have been targeted by Islamic terrorism before. I had the misfortune of translating a video of one of these attacks years ago. I'm still traumatized from it. So China has been working to establish better security relations in that region, not only with the central government, but with more independent Islamic groups in northern Pakistan as well. So they have a sense that there's a need to cooperate across the border. The thing in Afghanistan seems a little bit different, as I know that they were very swift to pick up mineral rights in Afghanistan in about 2001, 2002, right as we were cleaning up the initial invasion. And I do sense that the Chinese are realizing a need to protect their citizens abroad and their interests abroad with some kind of military presence. What's strange was, and I don't know where we are on this, I haven't seen this bit of the South China Morning Post, is that they were considering hiring what used to be Blackwater to manage some of that, both on their southern border with Myanmar and with Vietnam, and on the western border with Afghanistan and Pakistan. So we'll have to see how China decides to manage that security presence and keep from leaving a security footprint that seems too imperial. We shall see. Kelly?
So you mentioned that many people in the streets view speaking Chinese as a recognizable skill beforehand, but how many of them spoke Chinese before their language was eliminated from the education program?
Around 50%, which is for China really low for Mandarin fluency. There are 55 official minorities in China, and most of them will be bilingual to a pretty high degree. Even Tibetans will be pretty well bilingual in Tibetan and Chinese. Uyghurs seem to be a kind of holdouts. And I think that was part of why they pursued this policy in Xinjiang specifically and haven't done it elsewhere. There's a different test for Uyghurs to take for Mandarin before they get into college. There's a different system for assessing it and for teaching it. So yeah, in part because Uyghur literature is really well developed, and Uyghur media has always been really well developed. There's a lot to watch. You could live your life in Xinjiang and not really need to know Chinese. So that's different from a lot of other places. That's your question. Okay. Yeah, Patrick.
Blackwater was rebranded as Academy Equipment.
Academy, thank you. I know Eric Prince went to Beijing at some point. So how are we on time, Caitlin? Should we?
Actually, 1 o'clock. So we are at the end of our official time here. We do have the room a little longer if you wanted to take 1 or 2 more questions. So otherwise, we can thank you so much for coming and for opening our lecture series of the semester. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. And thank you for being a lovely audience. Thank you.